Hello PLO Order, welcome to another episode of videos. Today's topic is facing limps and how to play versus limpers. And sometimes they create problems because limping is not something you should probably do often, so you don't really know what kind of hands people limp, what kind of hands they don't limp. So let's get started. A few words about open limping. First one is that on small stakes the rate is really high. And we don't want to open limp ourselves. And the reason is that when the rate is high, pre-flop pots are not raked. So if we have any chance to steal the blinds pre-flop, it's good for us. And if we open limp ourselves, we have no chance to win the blinds. Unless we do some limp free raising, which is not a good strategy after all. So you want to open, so there's at least a chance that everyone folds and you win 1.5 big blinds free. That's 150 BP per 100 win rate in that situation, so it's huge. And that's the main reason. Do the rate, we don't want to limp. If there wouldn't be a rate, or the rate is really small, then there are spots where we could think about limping or have a decent limping strategy. But especially at small stakes, and especially when opponents are not super great, then you should not open limp. I repeat one more time, you should not open limp in general. And due to that, at small stakes, there is no such thing as a good limping range. No matter what someone tells you, in a standard strategy, there's no good limping range on PLO 50 and lower. And anyone who open limps, you can tell that they are not really good players. It would be really weird if a player was really good in PLO, but decides to limp pre-flop on small stakes. That just wouldn't make sense. In theory, it might be possible, but that would be really weird. Because the thing is that if he is a good player, he understands that open limping is not high EV situation. But there's an exception. If he's exploiting a maniac, which is kind of player, let's say he 3-bets every hand, then we would have a limping range for sure. And we actually would limp quite decent amount of hands that we don't want to play 3-bet pot, or we want to limp 3-bet or do something else. So we would consider anyone limping in normal situation without maniac, or he's not exploiting maniac, he's just opening limping hands. You can tell that he is not really good in PLO. It's not possible that someone is awesome, balanced, and good post-flop, but his pre-flop is just full of garbage. That just doesn't happen. About the limpers, the range is really hard to define. Some players limp most of the hands, then some limp only certain hands. Like they open 20%, but then they limp 50% on top of that. Or there's a rep playing 22, 15, 7 solid pre-flop stats, but decides to limp all crappy pocket tens, jacks and queens. Or rainbow kings. Or they limp naked ace, suited ace type of hand. So if the opponent is a guy who plays every hand, then he's just limping a lot of hands. But if he's a kind of tighter rep whose VPIP is less than 40 and he decides to limp, pay attention to his range. Because he might have a really narrow limping range and it's easy to play when you figure that one out. Well, the strategy versus limpers. Now, some of you might be expecting to see nice graphs, how solver plays versus limpers. And we could definitely do that. But the problem is that solver assumes the limper plays perfectly after the limp. So we can force opponent to limp 50% of hands, or limp only limp pre-flop. But then he would have a balanced limping range, and he would have limp 3 bets with balanced range, and he plays post-flop perfectly according to his range versus your range, and so on. Which makes the defending range different. Because in reality, the limper is most likely very passive post-flop. And to put those kind of parameters to solvers would be really hard. I mean, that would be insanely hard, probably. So solver doesn't really help us. We just have to use our brain. But no worries, no worries. You don't have to use your brain. I'll help you. When the limper is most likely passive post-flop, so he is one-dimensional, and he isn't good with mathematics or equities, which means he is not sure how much pot odds he needs, or he doesn't even know what pot odds are, he doesn't know how much he have equity, he cannot think in ranges, then he is probably overcalling with draws and weak hands a lot. Which means that you should have a huge post-flop edge. Not just tiny, but I mean huge. And that's why you want to play with the limper. Limper is not kind of player that you think that, oh, he limps, he's a bad, I don't want to play with him. You do, because it's so valuable. But we still want to have strong hand selection. Because if we start to play a lot of hands, like someone might think that, okay, limper plays 70% of hands, so we can play 50%, we have position, we're going to make money. But in reality, it's not that easy. Because the stronger your hand is, the easier it is to value bet. And you can think it as a line, where we have the nuts and we have the worst possible hand. And the more, or put it this way, let's put the, nuts here. So it's easy to understand. Nuts here, complete air here, the worst of the hand, best of the hands. So the more our hand is here, the easier it is value bet. But when we start to go towards the weaker hands in the line, then there comes this gray area we are not sure, should we value bet? Should we value bet bottom 2? Should we value bet middle pair? Should we value bet 7 high flush? And so on. And the more we go towards the weaker hands, the harder it is to value bet. And we bet he calls, we don't know where we stand. Because when passive player calls, it doesn't cap his range. His range is still insanely wide. So if we constantly put ourselves in a situation where we are not sure if we should value bet or not, it creates more opportunities for us to make mistakes. So make your range a bit tighter. It's easier to play post-flop. And when someone cold calls your range, which also happens quite often, you have a bit stronger range for those multi-way pots. And never ever bluff limper pre-flop. You should always assume that when someone limps, he's going to call no matter what the action is. There are occasions when limpers have folded pre-flop, but you shouldn't be expecting that. And general rule is don't limp along with limpers. Raise, isolate the limper or limpers. So don't start to limp behind. Don't go to their game as a general. There are some exceptions. We're going to get there. But don't play their game. Make them play your game, where we raise good hands. So when the pot is bigger, we get more value. Like, think about it this way. Let's say someone limps, you call, and small blind calls, big blind checks, pot is 4 BBs. And you flop the nuts, or with a strong hand, and you call for 3 streets of value. You bet 3 BBs on the flop, you get 1 caller from the limper, pot is 10 BB on the turn. Then you bet 7.5 BBs, he calls, pot is 25 on the river, and you make 17 BB value bet on the river. And if he calls, then the pot would be around 60 BBs in the end, and you get 30 BBs as value. Nice. Let's say someone limps, you open to 4.5 bb's, blinds fold, limper call, spot is 10.5 bb's on the flop. So the same size it was on the turn. Which means you bet 7.5 bb's, he calls, boom, pot is 25. You bet 17, he calls, pot is 60, and then comes the river. And now you can make 40 bb or 50 bb value bet, and if he calls, boom, the pot is 150 bb's. So instead of making 30 bb value, you made a 75 bb value when he calls 3 streets. And no matter whether he calls 1, 2, or 3 streets, you win more if the pot is bigger pre-flop. That's why we want to raise the limpers. Exceptional limp. Rule number 1. Do not limp behind multiple limpers as a standard strategy. And standard strategy means what is our default strategy when we don't have information to deviate from it a lot. So unknown limper, do not limp behind. Exception is the small blind, but only when you are facing limpers. Don't open limp even from the small blind in small stakes. When the range is lower, small blind has a limping range in solver if you choose to. In my opinion, you don't need it. You can still get the same win rate by just opening the hands you want to open and folding raised. But don't open limp. But if there's a limper or 2 or even 3, sometimes 4, I've seen those tables, on the small blind you should complete, because then you have to pay half a BB to see a pot. So pretty much 30% of hands, anything that is playable has one nut component or is decent to hit some flops. Just see the flop, it's half a BB. It's so cheap. So, what do we do versus those limpers? Okay, now you know that you should raise. Well, do we raise 50% of hands? Do we raise only nuts? Good rule of thumb is here. 1 limp means 1 step back. Really good rule of thumb. And then you isolate with your raise first in range. And you all should have pretty good idea of opening range here from different positions. If you don't, then shame on you. Go to YouTube, check the pre-flop coaching, and get your pre-flop up to date. But as you know your raising range here from different positions, then whatever position you have, 1 limper, you go back 1 position and use that opening range to isolate the limper. To make it easy. Example, you are in a button and you face a limp, and now it doesn't matter whether the limper is UTG, middle position, or cutoff, because limper doesn't have different limping range according to position. His UTG limp is as strong as cutoff limp. They don't have positional awareness, at least for limping. So the limping range is same no matter where he limps. But you face 1 limper and you are in a button. If you face 1 limper, you go 1 step back, which means that you raise your cutoff opening range, which should be around 30% or so. So from the button, you isolate 1 limper with 30% range. If you are in middle position and UTG limps, go back 1 step from middle position to UTG and isolate with your UTG range. If you are on the cutoff, you go back to your middle position opening range. Another example, you are in the cutoff, but UTG limps and middle position limps behind. So you're facing 2 limpers. No problem, you go back 2 steps. You raise your under the gun opening range. And that's a good starting point. In the end, I will say a few words about adjusting, but as a starting point, this is what you can use. So if you have no idea what to do here, just refer back to your opening ranges, go back one step per limper and raise that one, and you should be doing really, really well. Exception is from the small blind, you raise your under the gun range. And pretty much versus 1, 2, 3 limpers, no matter how many. If there's one or more limpers, you're on the small blind, your UTG range is 15% or 18% or 20%. It's so strong that you can just raise it for value. Just don't go bananas post-flop. Really important thing to understand that this is normal 100 pp PLO 6 max without antes, without splash money. If there's a splash money in the pot, which is currently only on run it once, but it might get more, people will like it more, it's more popular, and it might broaden to other sites too at some point. But if there's any dead money in the pot, and the splash money, some cash drops, whatever the reason is, then don't use this strategy. In splash pots, we have very different strategy where we start to limp because there's so much dead money in the pot. And in splash pots, people do open limp, and it's a valid strategy. Don't use this one in splash pots. If you want to know how to play splash pots, just vote for it in the polls, and I will let you know. All right, let's go forward. Post-flop strategy. All right. So we know what to do pre-flop. Well, post-flop, it really doesn't matter how we get to the post-flop. Whether we open and passive player calls or passive player opens, we call. It really doesn't matter. Because in general, it's range versus range. But the thing to remember is limpers are often passive. So general rules versus passive opponents apply. There's the way I like to label people, we have 4 different stereotypes of poker players, and loose passive is one of those, and we should know how to adjust versus loose passives in general. First one is thin value betting. So we value bet more than versus better players. And we start betting on the flop with value hands. We don't balance our checking back range versus passive players. This is really important to understand. We use balance to protect ourselves so that opponents can't exploit us. That's the only reason why we balance our ranges. And now if opponent is not good enough to exploit us, no matter what we do, then there's no reason to balance. Versus passive, call happy, high VPIP, passive players, there's no reason to balance anything. It's 100% exploit. So don't balance your ranges versus passive limpers. Or you can, but you're just giving away money. It's up to you. So when we have a strong hand, we want to bet on the flop, because it means that turn bets are bigger, river bets are bigger. And flop is a street where his calling frequency is highest, most likely, because that's when all his draws still has 2 more cards to come. From flush draw, it's the easiest to get values on the flop. On the turn, a bit harder. And on the river, if he has a missed draw, he's not giving you any value. So start value betting on the flop. You want to get 3 streets of value versus these players. Old poker wisdom is don't bluff calling stations, and in general it's true. If you find yourself constantly trying to bluff call happy player, you should redefine your strategy. But I think there are spots when we can bluff, and often it's a locked or try board. And if we have any blockers, it's great. So there are spots where we can bet on the flop anything, and he's not going to call often enough unless his calling range is insanely wide, which means that we switch from bluffing to insanely wide value betting. Another spot is triple barrel bluffs with blockers. And this is very often pocket pair on straight board. But you have to monitor the calling range. Do we do street read barrels? Like flop is queen jack 9 and you have pocket tens. You bet the flop, he calls, turn is a blank, you bet the turn, he calls, river is a blank, you bet, he calls with 2 pairs. Don't triple barrel that player. Don't start to triple barrel. Just go more for value betting when you have the hand. If he calls flop turn folds, snap folds, blank rivers, you know that okay, he's calling with draws, he folds them on the river, often you can go for triple barrel. But you have to monitor the river calling range. Some of these guys call river insanely light, some of them call flop and turn insanely light, but fold on the river unless they have pretty much the nuts. Or they make the flush or straight. But another rule is to respect aggression. I mean, when passive player decides to bet or dunk or raise, you should respect that. And he's not outplaying you. And no matter how unlikely it is him to have the hand he's representing, remember, their range is super wide and their calling range is not capped. So they can have the flop nuts when they check the 3 times and check raise the river. Or when unlucky backdoor draw comes there on the river, he could have it because he calls the flop with almost anything. So respect the aggression. Then if he starts to bet or raise you on every hand on rivers, then you adjust. And now the thing is here, as in any strategy or any part of our standard strategy, it means it's a strategy we use in normal situation. 100 pp deep, 6 max versus unknown opponents. Because that's our default to go strategy. I've explained this in the previous videos too. This is our go-to strategy. And as soon as you get information on the opponent, you can adjust. You don't have to use this strategy until the end of the world. If opponent gives insanely good value post-flop, then you could isolate with wider range, like UTG limps. You could isolate with cutoff range, 30% instead of UTG range. If opponent is very passive and just gives you so much value that it would be sin to waste those opportunities. Or the opponent is a wreck who limps only pocket pairs. Well, we might want to isolate with really wide range because the fold equity is super high post-flop. He's missing the flops. Or the opponent is aggressive who suddenly limps. You don't want to raise with too wide range there. That might be a trap. So always adjust when you have information. But if you don't have information, the opponent is unknown, you don't need to adjust. No need to adjust. So have fun with the limpers. I love passive coin stations because they are one-dimensional. You don't have to think, is he outplaying? When they raise you don't have to think how much he has bluffs in his range. What is the bottom of our bluff catching range? What does our hand look like? Or our range look like to him? It's just if he raises, it's for value. Then your question to answer is, what is his value range? And do we have good enough hand versus that? Because sometimes they raise you on the river without the nuts. They just overvalue certain hands. But they are fun. They are never outplaying you. That's the good part. They're honest, straightforward, and they are quite stress-free. Of course, when they hit those cut shots, often it sucks, but most often it's just you deciding how big the pot will be, or could be, and then they decide whether they want to call and make it a big one. But you can just value bet a lot. Just remember, don't limp behind, don't play balance post-flop versus limpers. Exploit, exploit, exploit. Alright? Have fun on the tables with limpers. Hope you enjoyed the PLO Order video. I will see you on the next video or next week. I don't yet know the topic, but you can go to the Discord and cast your vote on the poll. Alright? Thanks and bye-bye.